And I think this is like one of the most beautiful passages in the whole Bible. And this is one of the things I love about the book of Revelation. The deeper I get into it, is I realize it's such a brilliant genre to end the Bible with, because it forces you to constantly be connecting and thinking about the whole rest of the Bible. So it's like this awesome recap.
Paul Lamicela, welcome back to the Anabaptist Perspectives podcast. So we did an episode with you a couple months back that was got a lot of attention, I guess you could say. It was on how to read the book of Revelation, and I think it's the most requested follow-up that we've ever had for an episode is get you back on the podcast and go deeper into that, because there's a lot that we didn't go into in that episode. And of course, you can check it out in the description to those listening to this. So we're going to do that today. And I think specifically, you're going to be looking in a narrower slice of it instead of looking at the whole book. And I'd say let's just jump right in. I think we're in Revelation 21 and 22. So maybe you want to lay out some of the groundwork of what we're going to cover, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, well, it's good to be back. And I think that when we're looking at Revelation, I mean, there's so many things to talk about. One of my goals in the next few years is to teach a whole entire course on the book, because there's just so much to cover. But I think one thing that's helpful is to think of the beginning of Revelation, the middle of Revelation, the end of Revelation. So the beginning, you had the letters to the churches, and that helps to ground us and say, hey, this is a lens that we should use to read the book of Revelation. These were written to churches, not to help them speculate about what might happen in the year 2035, but to show them from God's perspective how they are to live their lives now with the persecution and the temptations they face. In the middle of the book is this really interesting pivot chapter in chapter 12 with this story of the woman and the dragon, and the woman who bears the Messiah and stuff, and then how the dragon, the devil, persecutes her and her seed, which is sort of this, in a nutshell, sort of story of the devil's sort of oppression of God's people for this whole age while we await Jesus' return. But then the end of the book is another one of these crucial points, because this is how the whole story ends. And it's also how the whole Bible ends. And there's a real significance to the way that the closing chapters of Revelation, chapter 21 and 22, really are sort of bookend the Bible and bring to completion the story that started in the Garden of Eden. So this Revelation 21 and then the first few verses of 22 have a lot of weird measurements, like the angels measuring the city, New Jerusalem.
It's very confusing, by the way.
It's like, okay. And then there's also these 12 stones that are in the foundation of the city. And then there's the streets that are made of gold, but the gold is clear as glass, which is pretty sweet gold. And then there's some strange trees that have a lot of fruit, and all this kind of stuff. And I think it's really helpful as an example, and a really important example, to say, hey, let's zoom in on this text. And this is John's depiction of how the story of the redemption, new creation sort of ends. The whole story of the Bible ends. And see how what it's doing is it's pulling together all these threads from the whole story of the Bible, specifically Eden and temple imagery. There's other stuff too that we can't get to in these chapters, like Jerusalem, the theme of Jerusalem, the theme of marriage, the bride, and all that. But I want to zero in on those two, Eden and temple, and show that that's what John is doing here. He's evoking those things.
So you're talking, we're essentially in the last chapters of the Bible, and John is pointing us back to basically Genesis 1, 2, and 3, if we're talking Eden, right? And temple. Right. So, okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So start walking us through that.
Yeah. Then. So, I mean, we have to say at the very beginning that temple is a theme that starts really in Genesis 1 and 2. And scholars now commonly talk about how Eden is sort of like a temple space. I like to say that maybe we can say rather that later temples are a little evocation of Eden. It goes so.
Ooh, I've never thought of that. So it's almost like I'm speculating here. Okay, I could be way off, but Eden, that's the place where God walks with man and so forth.
Exactly.
And the temple, which was that's where we go to meet God, essentially, in a lot of ways. Okay.
There's
okay.
there's a
I
lot.
can see some stuff there.
There's
Yeah.
a number of parallels. So like Eden is the place where God walks with His people, and that's the same language that's used later of the tabernacle, where God. This is the place by which God walks among His people. It's the place that there's this tree of life, which kind of mirrors later sort of the possibly some of the elements in the tabernacle. It seems to face east, which all temples later do. Adam and Eve are given the instructions to keep and to guard the garden, avad and shamar, in Hebrew, and those are instructions that are reminiscent of the same words are used for what the Levites are later called to do in the tabernacle. So there's the sense in which the Eden is this flourishing garden space where God's presence can be with His people, and that's what a temple is. It's this sort of intersection of God's space and human space. And in a post-fall, post-sin world, that space has to be confined to a temple because God's presence can't just roam, freely. And so temples are, in a sense, the spaces where we get closest back to Eden, this place where God and humanity come together. So Eden and temple are somewhat connected, and it starts right there in Genesis, 2 and 3. What's interesting then, of course, we have the temple in the tabernacle and the temple in Israel, and we have this space where God is saying, well, what does it mean to be my people and for God to be your God? Well, it means that He can dwell in your midst again, right? This is the one people, the people of Israel is the one people that God would actually be with, right? Because what Adam and Eve had done in the garden was temple desecration, right? They had ruined this place where God and humanity could dwell together through their rebellion, and so they get booted out. Exile is getting booted out of the temple, right? Out of God's space. And so the tabernacle and the temple, later temple, are this great thing because it's God saying, I can dwell among you, but it's also a really tragic thing because it's not God dwelling freely in the midst of His whole people. It's God dwelling in a confined temple within His people's space, right?
Yeah.
Israelites weren't just freely walking with God like Adam and Eve had because of their sin, because they actually are people who are banned from God's direct presence. Only certain priests could go into His presence, and only the high priest into the holiest place once a year, and only after performing all these rituals of atonement, these sacrifices and such. And so it's a beautiful thing, but it's also this constant recognition that we're never quite in that space, right? If you have a temple, it means God's in your midst, but it also means you're not. Sin hasn't been fully dealt with.
It's like a barrier in a way.
It is like
something.
Yeah, I mean, it is. It's great because a temple means God's there with you, and Jerusalem becomes this place where, this is God's city. And it's God's city because God's king is there, the Davidic king, and because the temple's there, and God's glory cloud is over it and such. And so if you want to get close to God, there is a physical location that is closer to God in a sense than anywhere else in the world, right?
Oh yeah, okay. That is kind of a wild thought.
It is, yeah.
I hadn't really thought of it like that.
Yeah,
before.
and so that's why David and the other psalmists will speak of how they long to be in the temple, because there's this sense in which that, of course, God is omnipresent and stuff, but God's sort of presence, His dwelling with His people, is in this place, and that's, if you want to be close to God and find forgiveness. It's why Solomon's prayer of dedication says, when you sin, you pray toward this house, and God will hear your prayer. And when Gentiles hear the great name of Yahweh, they'll come toward to this house, and God will forgive them and such. But then, of course, the temple is destroyed because of the people's rebellion. So it's a recapitulation of the Adam and Eve story, really, right? Israel as a whole rebels against God, just as Adam and Eve had done, and God's presence is removed. We have this like vision in Ezekiel where that weird book where God's presence. First, Ezekiel's shown this this vision of all these like weird abominations this really creepy vision of all this crazy stuff that's happening in the temple, right? People are sacrificing to all sorts of other gods and stuff. And then we have this vision where the chariot sort of lifts off and God's like leaving. And so the temple is destroyed because, and the people are sent into exile. They're removed from God's temple space. What's really strange in the history of Israel is that the vision of God dwelling among his people in blessing doesn't just disappear when Israel goes into exile. Instead, it actually gets ratcheted up big time. And like the prophets, Ezekiel, especially Ezekiel, but the others as well, speak of this day when God would, well, they all speak of this day when God would return to his people. Isaiah speaks of this coming new Exodus, when God would return to reign and to dwell with and to bless and forgive his people. And Ezekiel does the same thing by picturing a new temple. And so this is what in Ezekiel like 40 to 48, there's this huge vision of this eschatological temple. So he goes through, it's like chapters and chapters, because he's like measuring, counting, doing all these measurements and all this kind of thing. And some people have like mistakenly thought of this as some literal new temple that's supposed to be built someday.
Well, okay, this shows maybe the limitations of my understanding, but that's the only way I've heard that section.
Yeah.
We're in, Ezekiel, where's this
Ezekiel
again?
40 to 48.
Yeah, exactly. So the only one I've ever heard is that, this is a new thing that's going to happen at some point. There's going to be this new temple, blah, blah, blah. And people actually go through it and have a very literal, working through all the dimensions and building plans for it.
Right.
So you're saying that's off.
No, that's misguided.
Okay,
yeah.
so why?
Because for a couple of reasons. One, what he's speaking of is like right before it is this day. He's speaking of this day when God would put his spirit within his people, forgive them, inaugurate a new covenant with them. It's this age of this age of restoration that all the prophets have in mind. This is this broad idea. Someday God will cleanse us, forgive us, renew our hearts, the new covenant, And then, or he pictures it in chapter 37 as resurrection, the valley of dry bones. It's this vision of like the corporate resurrection, almost as though Israel is dead. And someday God's going to breathe new life into them, and restore them and stuff. And then the vision, we are, of course, used to thinking that like anything monotonous must be there for technical reasons, right?
Yes.
Because that
yes.
like immediately I think brings sort of like instruction manual to mind, or one of those things where you're supposed to build this kit.
We're like, well, it's just like a blueprint or something.
Exactly.
So we're reading Ezekiel, 40 whatever, 40 through 48 as some kind of instruction manual.
Right. But I don't think that's the case for multiple reasons. One, I think he's deliberately trying to evoke the dimensions and the description and stuff that were the kind of tedious description of the tabernacle back in the Torah. He's doing that again. By going on and on about this many cubits, you're supposed to go back and think, oh yeah, this is like when God told us to build the first temple. So it's meant to point back to that. But there's really weird, fantastic features to this temple. And as some scholars point out, there's no height, doesn't seem to be any height dimensions on this temple. So good luck trying to build it. It's hard to say how high it should be. But the other thing is that when the temple was rebuilt, in what we call the second temple, no Jewish person thought that it was the fulfillment of this at the time, right? Everyone was pretty bummed, right? There's the passage in Ezra,
right? Yeah,
yeah, where there's like the new temple's erected, and there's people like yay, but there's a few like 90-some-year-old guys there that still have like the first iPhone version, and they're scrolling back and looking at their photos that they had taken of the first temple right before they got carted off to exile, and they're like, "Look, there's no comparison, right? This new thing it's small, it's insignificant, it's it's anticlimactic, right?" So they didn't think that that's what it was. I think really significantly at the middle of his vision. So there's all these sort of measurements and this and that and the other thing. But when it comes down to it, right at the in chapter 47, you get this. I'm just going to look at a couple of these because what Ezekiel himself seems to be doing is reflecting on Eden and weaving in some Eden imagery
Interesting.
into his temple. Yeah.
Okay.
So chapter 47, the angel brings Ezekiel back to the door of the temple, and water is issuing from below the threshold of the temple toward the east. The temple faced east, all temples, that's common. And the water was flowing down from below the south end of the threshold. And this is when you start thinking of water that's flowing out of the temple. This itself may remind you of the way that these rivers flowed out of the Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
So the Garden of Eden had this tree of life, this sort of tree of immortality in the middle of it. And it also had these 4 rivers that like symbolically sort of bring life to the whole world, right? It's like at the middle of this garden is the source of life that goes throughout the whole world, right? And here, it's similar idea, but it's flowing out of the middle of this new temple, this new space where when God finally restores his people, will dwell with them on this grander, permanent scale. And he goes through all these details to show this is going to be permanent, it's going to be grand, it's going to renew creation.
Okay.
And so then he keeps going, and they talk about how he keeps going in verse 3, and the water becomes ankle deep, and then it becomes knee deep, and eventually it gets so deep that you have to swim. You know, the water from the temple just flows into this mighty river. And then he says, I went back and I saw on the bank of the river many trees on one side and on the other. And he said to me, this water flows toward the eastern regions and goes down to the Arabah and enters the sea. And when the water flows into the sea, the water will become fresh. So this water is like, because it flows from God's presence, it brings life and makes fresh everything it touches, right? Okay. It's this water that enlivens the whole world. Wherever the river goes, every living creature will live, and there'll be many fish. Fishermen will stand beside the sea. I guess if you like to fish, that'd be an awesome place to go. And then on the banks, on both sides of the river, will grow all kinds of trees for food. Their leaves will not wither, and their fruit will not fail, but they will bear fresh fruit every month, because the water for them flows from the sanctuary. Their leaves will be for food, and their fruit will be for food, and their leaves for healing. So it's this. He's envisioning not a literal place that you can build. You really couldn't build this if you tried, but this era when God would so come back to his people and renew them, but also through his presence that's finally able to dwell fully and permanently with his people, would renew creation, right? It's this ultimate day of restoration.
So then why all the tedious or extensive details that are in like these 8 chapters about this temple? Is that just because it's trying to point us back to what we're seeing in the Torah, say, about the tabernacle? Or what's the reasoning there then?
Yeah, I think it's trying to point us back and do something similar to what Moses had done, like write out all these, look, let's think of it this way, all these details. Okay. Another reason is it's visionary literature. And so visionary literature can sometimes include tedious what from a modern Western perspective seems like tedious details. So genealogies are another thing that feel very tedious to us. Yeah. But they don't feel tedious to some people in other cultures. For some people, that's like, wow, this is amazing. I remember hearing a missionary talk about this kind of unreached people group that he went to. And of course, he is prone to just like, let's go over the genealogies. But he starts reading them. Everyone's like, this is really great. This is really important. Because it shows like who his dad was and his dad was, right? Yeah. And so,
that's it. So that's so
some of it's cultural, right? And we have there's other examples of literature that's something like Revelation that's written way after this time of these great eschatological battles that are going to happen. This Dead Sea Scrolls people wrote this text, and they go into incredible detail, mind-numbing detail about how each of these 7 battles is going to take place and what they're going to write on each of these banners and like who's going to win each one and all this. And you're like, right? But that's interesting. That's the way, that's just the way it worked. They were fine with that. So, and they didn't seem to think that this was a real battle. I mean, it's hard to be a predict. I mean, they were writing it as though they knew the outcome of each one, and yet going into all these details. It's a vision, right? And you can do that. So, but I think one of the clinchers is that and the reason I spent time on this is that this passage is what John's drawing on in his picture of the age to come, the new creation. So the way the New Testament authors appropriate this, John specifically, is not in a physical building, in keeping with the whole rest of the New Testament, right? Because when Jesus shows up in John's gospel, John opens it up in chapter 1 by saying, the Word was with God, the Word was God, and the Word became flesh, became human, and then he says, and tabernacled among us. And that word is the same word group that's used, the word, it means tented, or tabernacle, literally. It's related to the word that is used of the tabernacle in the Old Testament. And then in the very next chapter of John, Jesus says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up, and everyone's freaking out. And and then John gives an aside, but he was speaking of the temple of his body. And so in the New Testament understanding, it's Jesus that becomes that new temple space.
Yeah. And
then because of Jesus' for atoning work, the Spirit being outpoured on believers makes all of his people a new temple, which is what Ezekiel was saying about the Spirit being poured out. And then finally in Revelation will lead to the time and place when the entire new creation will be God's temple space. And Eden space.
Wow, that's really something. Yeah. So
now I still have to substantiate that by some details in this, but that's the backdrop.
Yeah, that's just so interesting because, like, again, the Ezekiel thing. It feels like I've heard people kind of getting derailed maybe a bit on the details and trying to say this is a literal thing, like this is going to happen this exact way, and et cetera, et cetera. But I've never heard like the bigger picture that you're outlining here.
Right.
That seems to make a little more sense.
Right.
So you know what I mean. And I'm just kind of,
and it fits with the whole rest of the story.
Yeah, exactly.
Both Old Testament and New. Right.
So okay, so yeah, hit some of these details here now. Yeah. Now we're back in Revelation 21 and 22.
Yeah. So I'll just go through a few of these details. Please. Right. So 21. Then I saw, and I think this is like one of the most beautiful passages in the whole Bible. And this is one of the things I love about the book of Revelation. The deeper I get into it, is I realize it's such a brilliant genre to end the Bible with, because it forces you to constantly be connecting and thinking about the whole rest of the Bible. So it's like this awesome recap. Then I saw a new heaven and new earth, and that line comes from Isaiah, when Isaiah says, or quoting Yahweh or whatever, says, I saw a new heavens and a new earth that God was going to create, right? For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And this imagery of the sea in the ancient world represents chaos. It represents, in some ways, in Genesis 1, where before God sort of formed the earth, it says the earth was formless and void, darkness was over the face of the deep, and the waters are this chaotic chaotic thing. And in some other literature, there may be sea monsters or other beings that represent the chaos of the sea.
Which you would see some of that in the Old Testament as well, right? In Job with Leviathan, or
exactly.
Some of these things. Yeah,
okay. Totally. And the ancient Israelites were not seafaring people, so the sea is not this place of great exploration for them. It's a scary place. So the sea is no more. So it's not saying that on the new earth there's not going to be any oceans necessarily. Okay,
because I've heard people say that.
Right? No, that misses the point. The point is that this God will once again will fully eliminate that sort of source of chaos and stuff like that. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And we're not going to talk about that imagery. And then I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the dwelling place, or the tent of God. It's that same, it's related to the same word that John uses in John chapter 1 about Jesus becoming human and tenting with us. Or it's the same word that's used in the Old Testament for the tabernacle. The dwelling place of God is with human beings. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. And that phrase is called the covenant formula. And it occurs all over the place in Exodus and in the prophets. It's this it's kind of like the very core essence of their vows between God and Israel. God says, I will be God to you in a unique way, and you will be a people to me. And this is going to be the day when that will be fully true forever. He will wipe away every tears from their eyes. Death will be no more, etc. Verse 10. Well, actually, verse 9. One of the angels came and said, come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. And this is one of these places in Revelation that you hear one thing and then you turn around and what you see is different from what you hear. Okay. So behold, the Lion of Judah conquers. And then John turns and he sees a lamb that looks like it had been slain, right? Things like that. Or 144,000 are numbered, the 12 times 12 times 1,000. And then John looks and he sees a great innumerable multitude from every tribe, people, and nation. They're one thing, one reality, but spoken of in two different ways because you have to put them together. So the bride is also the city, and it has the glory of God. Its radiance like a most rare jewel, and it has this wall with 12 gates, and etc. And the wall of the city has 12 foundations. The 12 gates and the foundations represent the apostles and Israel. So it's this which goes back to the imagery of why Jesus chose 12 apostles to begin with. It's Jesus chose 12 because this represents the fulfillment of the 12 tribes of Israel, right? What he was doing is renewing, restoring, bringing to completion the story of Israel, which will of course include all the nations, but it's that story continuing. And then finally back to the temple imagery. The one who spoke had a measuring rod of gold to measure the city and its gates and its walls. So now we start thinking, oh no, the angel with the measuring tape. And that immediately gets us back to Ezekiel.
Oh, okay.
And we're like, here we go, right? But he's measuring the city this time.
Interesting. Okay.
Right?
Okay. I think I'm tracking. This is, I've not thought about it like this before.
And then they measure it, and the city lies foursquare, the length the same as its width. Yeah, okay, that's interesting. And he measured the city with his rod, 12,000 stadia. And it's this 12 number again.
Yeah.
Which for Revelation always means sort of the fullness of God's people. It's Israel times 1,000, or Israel times 1,000.
Yeah.
144,000 is the same idea. Mm-hmm. He also measured its, and then he says its length and its width and its height are equal. So it's a cube. And you're like, why is that interesting?
Yeah. I've always wondered about the cube thing.
Yeah, it's like it's not like we're going to live in some sort of cosmic Rubik's Cube or something like that.
But again, I've only ever heard people say, "Oh yeah, this is going to be a real thing. These exact dimensions. It's going to happen real exactly just like this,
right.
Literally." And you're saying, "No, we're kind of missing the point."
I think
here.
that's actually really sad because what John's trying to say is something way more profound. So he's picturing this as this Israel times 1,000 type of place. In other words, this New Jerusalem, which we've just been told is the bride, so it's all of God's people. This new place where God and humanity will finally dwell together is a cube, and the only other cubic space in the rest of the Bible is there's only one, and it's the Holy of Holies. Like,
well, interesting. Okay. Oh,
yeah,
huh. Okay, so keep going.
What John is saying right here, and then so you think, okay, that's weird. It's a cube.
Interesting.
An angel's measuring it like Ezekiel's temple, this vision of when God would finally dwell with his people again, and it represents the fullness of all God's redeemed humanity, Israel times Israel, whatever times 1,000, and it's the shape of the Holy of Holies, and then. He keeps going. He measured the wall and keeps going. The wall was built of jasper. The city is a pure gold, clear as glass. The foundations of the wall were adorned with every kind of jewel. And then he goes and lists 12 jewels that make up the foundations of the city. Mm-hmm. The first is jasper. The second, sapphire, agate, emerald, onyx, carnelian, and it keeps going. And you're like, what's the significance of these?
Yeah.
And what's amazing is that they're not exactly identical, but they are significantly over. They're based on the 12 jewels that the high priest wore on his breastplate.
Okay.
Signifying the 12 tribes, right? And then, so right here, what John is trying to say is when God finally creates this new heavens and new earth, and all things, as Tolkien says, when all things sad have come untrue, God will finally dwell with his people to such a degree that his presence with them will be the Holy of Holies. That all of us together living with him in this new creation. The next line that John says is, "I saw no temple in the city, for its temple is the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb." There is no temple because the entire new earth is the Holy of Holies. That God's presence is off the charts permanently with his people. That space where God really was, the place where only the high priest could go only once a year, only after all the rituals were done, is now the whole new creation. God dwells with his people freely, fully, completely, unlimitedly. The breastplate that used to be on the high priest with the stones representing his tribe of Israel, that's baked into the foundation of the city.
Okay, yeah. I'm starting to see that. That's wow. So, is there more pieces here about the Holy of Holies connection and the cube? Just keep going. I guess. Yeah.
So I saw no temple in the city because its temple is the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb. Mm-hmm. Finally, there's no more need for a different temple. Now we're back to Eden, where we don't need a separate temple because God's throne and the Lamb just can dwell openly in it, just like they did in Eden. I mean, just like God walked in the garden with Eden, or just like the Holy of Holies. That's the only one. That's the space, right? The city also has no need of sun or moon to shine on it because the glory of God gives it light, and its lamp is the Lamb. So, like the whole New Jerusalem or the whole new creation. Again, this is symbolic. We're not saying anything about the physics or the astronomy of the new earth, but we're saying that like that glory, that pillar of fire that used to rest over the tabernacle, is now what fills the whole new earth with light. Right? God's glory is full.
Okay, so the pillar of fire, like walk me through that connection a bit. Like, because you just use that Old Testament imagery of the pillar of fire, and you're saying this is pointing us back to that. Then
I think so. At least it's reminiscent. That connection isn't as like explicitly clear, but I think that's an image that you would naturally think of.
But isn't that part of the imagery where the cloud comes over the temple and the tabernacle and says, okay, God's presence is now in here,
right?
In the tabernacle,
right?
So maybe
So
I see what you're saying.
This cloud. But there's also going to be this fire, right? And this fire was the thing that guided the people of Israel and protected them by night and rested over the holiest place or whatever. And it's God's Holy of Holies presence that's now filling the whole new creation with light.
Wow. Yeah.
By its light, the nations will walk, the kings will bring their glory into it, etc. There's more stuff there. But then, because that's more Jerusalem related, I'm going to skip that. Chapter 22, the angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, which flowed from the throne of God and the Lamb through the middle of the street of the city. Now, this is very clearly Ezekiel, the river of life.
Yeah. Okay.
So remember, that was a river that flowed out of the sanctuary.
Out of the temple. Right. Okay.
And it gave life to everything. This time, it's slightly tweaked because it is flowing, the whole thing, the whole new creation is the temple. It's flowing directly from the throne of God and the Lamb, right? And that the throne of God and the Lamb is just directly like rejuvenating the world, giving life to the world. And I think John probably means for the river of life to represent the Spirit, right? This is probably a Trinitarian. Okay. It's very John, right? To think of water and Spirit. I mean, he does in his gospel, assuming this is written by the same John. The Spirit and water are used interchangeably. And so this water flows from the throne of God and the Lamb through the middle of the street of the city, and also on either side of the river, the tree of life, with its 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit each month. That's straight out of Ezekiel, the river of the vision that we read earlier from Ezekiel 48, where the river of life flows out of this new temple, and there are trees that grow on either side, and they bear fruit every month, right? But John here in Revelation has a little bit confusing. There is a little debate on this. It's possible he means to say trees. There's a bit of a debate, but assuming that the singular is the right reading, which I think it is, he has the tree of life growing on either side of the river, which is like super weird, and is like one of the reasons I say you shouldn't try to make movies or draw the book of Revelation, right? It works as a literary text, and it makes terrible movies, as we all know. But what he's doing here is he's combining the imagery from the Garden of Eden with Ezekiel's temple vision. So Ezekiel,
that's wild.
Isn't it wild?
Wow. Yeah, that
Ezekiel has trees, plural, on either side of the river. John says, yeah, I want to bring that in, but also I want to talk about the tree of life. And so he has the tree of life growing on each side of the river.
That's
right.
That I've never thought about it quite like that. How he is combining Eden and
it's Eden and temple,
and Ezekiel. That is wild.
And he's saying that this ultimate day, there will come this day when the Garden of Eden will be restored. All creation will be renewed. Right. All creation will be renewed. God's presence will fully dwell with his people again. The vision of Ezekiel for a world in which God's direct presence among his people, the whole earth can be the Holy of Holies because sin is fully eradicated. And God's Spirit can once again bring life to all the world directly, right? And the tree of life is again there. It's that finally the tree of life is back.
Yeah.
And then he quotes the next line, the leaves of the trees were for the healing of the nations. That's straight out of Ezekiel with one tweak. Ezekiel said the leaves of the tree will be for healing. And John adds of the nations, right? Because in keeping with the way he's seen redemptive history play out, right? That it is this global thing. And then the next line, no longer will there be anything accursed. And finally we think back to Genesis 3 of the curse. And we have finally the undoing of the curse, the bringing back of the pre-fall Eden, right? But the throne of God and the Lamb will be in it, and his servants will worship him. They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads. And night will be no more. They will need no light of lamp or sun, for the Lord God will be their light, and they will reign forever and ever. And there's so much more imagery there. But I think what I want to just emphasize here is that if you think of this as telling you that you're going to live in heaven with streets of gold or something like that, or you're saying, how is this cube-shaped thing going to work? You miss, I think, the really mind-blowing beauty of what John is trying to say, which is because Jesus gave his life for his people, we are, as Christians, as those who have been given the Spirit, who are little mini temples already, and who, as corporately as churches, are groups of God's temple presence. That's what Pentecost, the tongues of fire, represent little sort of pillars of fire on each person, right?
Oh, I've never thought of that, but that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
And the rushing wind represents the blowing wind in Genesis when God creates the world, right? The Spirit of God hovered over the waters. It's new creation, new temple. So Pentecost represents.
Wow.
And so we're living in that a little bit, and John is saying the story ends with this day when we'll get back to Eden, but better. When the physical creation will be renewed, the curse will be removed, the tree of life will be back, and temple will the whole instead of temple, God's presence having to be confined to one space, the whole temple, because of Jesus' atoning work, the whole new creation will be the Holy of Holies. And we will there was this passage in Exodus where Moses asks to see God's face, and God says, no one can see my face and live. And he gives him a glimpse of the back of his robe. And right here, Revelation ends here saying they will see his face. right? Finally that. And that's what the vision ends with. And so what John is, back to the letters to the churches, John is calling his readers to be one who overcomes, right? And right here in chapter 21, to the one who conquers will have this heritage, and I will be his God and he will be my son. And that is what we're supposed to say, how do we live as people who will belong in a world where that's true, where God's presence is so palpable, when we feel the rays, warmth on our arms, it'll be the rays of the glory of God, so to speak, right? And he brings together all this imagery of temple and Eden to portray this so imaginatively, but really vividly, I think.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because it's very easy with our style of reading the text. You read something like that and it's like, ooh, let's draw a blueprint of what that's going to look like. Let's get out our measuring sticks and how's it going to be set up. And I guess it's not wrong, but what you're saying here, there are so many more layers of meaning that get lost if you go down that street. Yeah. Is that a fair way of saying it? Oh yeah,
absolutely. And I think that just kind of misses the boat completely, right? Because again, John is stacking images on top of each other that don't literally work together, right? Remember, the New Jerusalem, which he measures, he just said it's the bride, the wife of the Lamb. Yeah. Right?
That's a very good point.
This is not meant to be read literally, very explicitly. I mean, no bride wants this angel going and measuring her and turning out to be a cube shape. That's not cool.
I mean, I never thought of that. Yeah. That's actually quite because I would have read. There's tons of stuff out there, reading about heaven and what's it going to be like, and they're taking stuff like this and putting it very literally, like literal gold, literal this, literal. Right, you're literally inside a cube. I was like, okay, that's interesting, I guess. But the problem that I ran into with that is eventually just kind of got burned out with it, because it's like, well, how is this relevant to me right now? Like, it's not at all. I mean, it's interesting to think about, I guess. Like one day it might be like this. But again, what you're saying, you're going through, there's a lot of layers of meaning here. And suddenly you're pulling things out that's like, oh wait, this is actually this is immediately relevant to us right now. Right. And we're kind of missing that if we're relegating it to some literal thing that's going to happen way down the line somewhere.
Right. And this will happen someday.
Right.
I mean, it represents something that will happen someday. Of course. Not literally, but really. I mean, there will be a renewal of creation, and God's presence will really dwell with his people. That's literal.
Absolutely.
Okay? It's just, there's going to be comments, He doesn't have he doesn't believe.
Yeah, no, and that's not what I'm trying to say, right? Yeah, I'm trying to get the wording right, because you can miss so much of the beauty of how is this relevant to me right now?
Which is strange, because that is John's purpose of the book, as evidenced by his exhortations throughout, but especially through the letters to the 7 churches. It's all about practical relevance. This is actually supposed to be a super practical book.
Interesting way of phrasing that.
It is, because it's all about, look, you're living in a world where you face persecution, but also temptation. And if you don't have this God's eye vision of the judgment that's to come, which we didn't talk about today, and then the final sort of restoration that's to come, you very well might capitulate, right? You very well might end up with the beast's name on your forehead instead of God's name on your forehead.
Back to that whole overcoming or enduring to the end.
It's all about that. And so you're supposed to say, whoa, that the theme of temple is coming to its fulfillment. Someday, if I remain faithful to Jesus, he will raise me from the dead and into a new earth where his presence with me is a forever holy of holies, and where everything that the Spirit's presence touches, there's life everywhere.
Yeah.
Or I get cast into the lake of fire.
I mean, and that is the super vivid contrast that we're seeing here at the end of the book, right?
Exactly.
So as people are listening to this, they're probably being like, okay, how can I learn more? Where can they go to dig into this more? Like these layers of meaning, for example, is this just go and reread Revelation and read some of these other passages, like you're referring to Genesis and Ezekiel and things. Yeah, what would you recommend people do from here?
There's a lot of good stuff that people can do. So if you're looking for resources, there's a bunch of good stuff out there. There's some really good commentaries. There's one that's fairly accessible by Craig Keener in the NIVAC series. It's not like a huge, enormous one. It's very good. There are some big ones out there that are a bit overwhelming, but another good resource, that all-around resource that I quite like, is the commentary on the New Testament use of the Old. It's this big fat book that goes through the New Testament and points out and explains not all, but the majority of allusions to the Old Testament. So there's a chapter in there on the book of Revelation, and that can be a good place to go to start out with. There's a lot of stuff depending on what level you're looking for. But then also I think to remember that what John is doing here is to weave together the threads of the whole story of the Bible, and he's doing it in this vivid apocalyptic way, right? That tells the same story as we read in the rest of the Bible. And so if you can come to the text from that perspective and look for allusions to the Old Testament, sometimes alongside to help, like one of the resources I just mentioned, that can be a good place to start, I think. And then the challenge to all of us is to not just understand what the text says, but to let it impact the way we live. And that's the hard part.
That's honestly, that's kind of the real test, right? Because you can tear into, all these, the layers of meaning and all that. Oh, that's really interesting. But then, okay, yeah, but will it affect how I live?
Right.
Yeah. I think that's the big piece there. That was really something. I like the point you had there, how John is weaving together all these threads of scripture. And I feel like, at least for myself, I wish I would have heard some of that sooner, because it's likewise. So easy to get lost. You just get lost, and you go back to, metaphorically speaking, pulling out the measuring stick and trying to draw the blueprint of the thing. And it's like, well, there's a little more going on here.
Yes.
This is fascinating. I really appreciate you taking the time to dive into a specific chunk of Revelation. That was definitely some of the comments and feedback we were getting from last time. It's like, wow, this was really good. Can you go into to specifics of the book itself? Is there anything else you'd like to add as we wrap this episode up?
I don't think so. I better not, because once you start with Revelation, there's no stopping. It just everything just keeps going. So. Yeah,
there's a lot there. Well, hopefully this is encouraging the listeners to pick up the book of Revelation again, give it another read, and dig into this more. Hopefully that's the result. So really appreciate you taking the time to share this. It's been fascinating.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to this episode about Revelation with Paul Lamicela. If you enjoyed this conversation, go check out the earlier episode we did with him on how to read the book of Revelation. That's linked in the description down below. And of course, all our content is available on our website at anabaptistperspectives.org. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.